My name is Dr. Marcus Webb. I'm 67 years old now, retired since 2015, but for 42 years I served as a medical examiner in two of the busiest morgues this country has ever known. I started at Bellevue Hospital in New York City in 1973, when the tools of our trade were still rudimentary, when we documented our findings on typewriters and stored tissue samples in glass jars labeled by hand. Later, I moved west to the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office, where I handled cases that still echo in the public memory: mysterious celebrity deaths, the remains left behind by serial killers, the mounting casualties of epidemics that swept through our cities like invisible storms. I witnessed forensic medicine evolve from analog methods to digital precision, from gut instinct and magnifying glasses to DNA sequencing and computerized toxicology. I've stood in countless refrigerated rooms, alone with the dead, learning to read the silent language they speak through lividity, rigor mortis, and the subtle discolorations that tell stories no living mouth could utter. I've spent more hours in the company of corpses than most people spend with their families. And in all those years, in all those cold, fluorescent-lit rooms, I learned that the dead are predictable. They don't move. They don't breathe. They don't reach out. But there was one night, one long, suffocating night in the winter of 1987, when everything I believed about the stillness of death was challenged in ways I still struggle to reconcile. It was February. Los Angeles was experiencing an unusual cold snap, temperatures dropping into the low 40s at night, which for that city felt almost Arctic. The morgue was understaffed, as it often was during budget cuts and administrative reshuffling. I had volunteered to work the overnight shift, partly out of necessity and partly because I'd always preferred the silence of those late hours. There's a particular quality to a morgue after midnight: the hum of the refrigeration units, the distant murmur of traffic outside, the way shadows pool in corners where the overhead lights can't quite reach. It's a space that exists outside normal time, a threshold between the world of the living and whatever comes after. That night, I was alone. Completely alone. The security guard had called in sick, the night janitor had finished his rounds early, and the administrative offices upstairs were dark and locked. It was just me, my paperwork, and the rows of stainless steel drawers that lined the walls of the main storage room. I had no reason to enter the secondary freezer. No reason at all. But sometimes, in this work, you're drawn to places you shouldn't go, compelled by instincts you can't quite name. And when I opened that heavy insulated door and stepped inside, when I heard the lock mechanism engage behind me with a soft, final click, I realized I had made a mistake that would cost me more than just a few hours of discomfort. Before we begin, if you find comfort in these late-night accounts from my years inside the morgue, you may want to stay close. More stories like this one tend to surface when you least expect them, and I hate for you to miss what comes next. So, if you wish to keep following these quiet journeys through the shadows of history, feel free to subscribe. And if this kind of story resonates with you, a simple like helps more than you know. Now, let's proceed. I want you to settle in now. Find a comfortable position, somewhere you won't be disturbed for the next while. If you can, dim the lights around you. Close your eyes if you wish, or let them rest half open, unfocused, allowing my voice to guide you back to that February night in 1987. Let the world outside fade for a moment. The demands of the day, the noise and static of modern life, set them aside. What I'm about to share with you isn't easy to tell, and it isn't easy to hear, but it's the truth as I experienced it, and I've carried it with me for more than 3 decades. In this work, we encounter things that defy easy explanation, moments when the boundary between the rational and the impossible becomes thin, almost translucent. You learn to trust your senses even when they report things your mind wants to reject. You learn to document what you see, what you hear, what you feel, even when it contradicts everything your training has taught you. So breathe slowly. Let your shoulders drop. And walk with me back into that freezer, back into the cold, back into a night when the dead refused to remain still. The secondary freezer at the Los Angeles County Coroner's office was not a place you entered casually. It was located at the far end of the building, past the main autopsy suites, past the toxicology lab, down a corridor that always seemed longer at night than during the day. The door itself was heavy, reinforced, the kind used in industrial cold storage facilities. It opened inward on pneumatic hinges that hissed softly when released, and it locked automatically from the outside as a safety measure, a design flaw, we always said, but one that had never been corrected because the freezer was rarely used after hours, and when it was, there were always at least 2 people present. That night, I was alone. I had gone down that corridor carrying a file folder in one hand and a flashlight in the other, though the overhead lights still worked. I don't remember now what prompted me to check on the secondary storage. Perhaps it was a nagging sense that I'd left something undone, a detail overlooked in one of the cases pending review. Perhaps it was simply the restlessness that sometimes overtakes you during a long night shift, the need to move, to occupy yourself with small tasks that give the illusion of productivity. Whatever the reason, I walked that corridor, pushed open that heavy door, and stepped inside. The temperature hit me immediately. The main refrigeration units kept bodies at around 38 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to slow decomposition but not so cold that tissues became brittle. The secondary freezer, however, operated at a much lower temperature, close to 0 degrees, and was used primarily for long-term storage of remains awaiting identification or pending legal resolution. The air inside was dry and sharp, each breath stinging the back of my throat. The space was larger than you might imagine, roughly the size of a small warehouse, with metal shelving units arranged in rows stretching back into shadows that the overhead fluorescents couldn't quite penetrate. Body bags lay on those shelves, some zipped fully closed, others partially open where preliminary examinations had been conducted. I counted 19 bags visible from where I stood near the entrance. 19 bodies in various states of preservation, each one a story interrupted, a life terminated under circumstances that required official scrutiny. I'd been around the dead long enough that their presence didn't disturb me. They were work. They were evidence. They were silent patients who required my attention and expertise. But standing there in that freezing space, my breath clotting in front of me, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a prickle of unease along my spine, a subtle rawness in the air that I couldn't immediately identify. I moved deeper into the freezer, my footsteps echoing off the concrete floor. The file I carried contained information about a John Doe who'd been brought in 3 weeks earlier, found in an alley downtown with no identification and no obvious cause of death. Toxicology had come back clean, the autopsy had revealed nothing definitive, and the case was still pending further investigation. I wanted to review the body again, to see if I'd missed something in my initial examination. I located his tag number on one of the shelves near the back, a bag positioned at shoulder height, and I reached up to pull it forward when I heard the sound. It was faint at first, barely audible over the hum of the refrigeration compressors. A soft rustling, like fabric sliding against fabric. I paused, my hand still resting on the body bag zipper, and listened. The sound came again, this time from somewhere to my left, several rows over. I told myself it was the building settling, or perhaps the compressor cycling on, creating small vibrations that traveled through the shelving units. But the sound had a quality that those explanations didn't quite cover. It was rhythmic, almost deliberate, like something shifting position with slow, measured intent. I stepped away from the John Doe and moved toward the source of the sound, my flashlight beam cutting through the dim spaces between the shelves. The secondary freezer had been designed without much thought for lighting. There were overhead fixtures every 20 feet or so, but between them the shadows gathered thick and stubborn. I swept my light across the body bags on the nearest shelf, looking for any sign of movement, any explanation for what I heard. Everything appeared still. The bags lay exactly as they should, inert lumps of black vinyl with identification tags zip-tied to the handles. But the unease I'd felt earlier was growing stronger now, becoming something more tangible, more urgent. My pulse had quickened. I could feel my heart beating against my ribs, could hear the rush of blood in my ears beneath the constant mechanical drone of the compressors. I moved to the next row, then the next, systematically checking each shelf, each bag, trying to locate the source of the rustling. And that's when I realized the temperature had dropped. Not by much, maybe 5 degrees, but enough to notice. My breath was coming out in thicker clouds now, and the cold was beginning to penetrate my lab coat, seeping through to my skin. I turned to head back toward the entrance, intending to check the thermostat controls, and that's when I heard the door. The sound was unmistakable, the heavy pneumatic hiss of the hinges, followed by the solid metallic thunk of the locking mechanism engaging. Someone had closed the door from the outside. I stood frozen for a moment, not quite believing what I'd heard, then I broke into a run, my footsteps pounding against the concrete as I raced back toward the entrance. I reached the door and grabbed the handle, pulling hard, but it didn't budge. The lock had engaged fully. I was sealed inside. I pounded on the door with my fist, shouting, calling out for anyone who might be within earshot, but the freezer was soundproofed, designed to contain the noise of the compressors, and I knew my voice wouldn't carry beyond these walls. I tried the emergency release handle. Every industrial freezer is supposed to have one, a failsafe to prevent exactly this kind of situation, but when I pulled it, nothing happened. The mechanism was either broken or had been disabled. I pulled again, harder, throwing my weight into it, but the door remained stubbornly closed. Panic began to rise in my chest, a cold, tight sensation that had nothing to do with the temperature. I was locked in a freezer, alone, with 19 bodies, and no one knew I was here. I forced myself to take slow, measured breaths, to think clearly despite the fear that was trying to overwhelm my rational mind. I still had my flashlight. I still had my wits. The freezer was equipped with an intercom system that connected to the main security desk, though I never had occasion to use it. I moved along the wall near the entrance, running my hand over the cold metal surface, searching for the intercom panel. I found it mounted about 6 feet up, a small rectangular box with a call button and a speaker grill. I pressed the button and waited. Static crackle from the speaker, but no voice responded. I pressed it again, holding it down longer this time. This is Dr. Webb in the secondary freezer. The door is locked and I'm trapped inside. If anyone can hear this, I need immediate assistance. More static, but no response. I tried several more times, varying my message, increasing the urgency in my tone, but the intercom remained silent except for that empty, hissing static. Either the system wasn't working, or there was simply no one on the other end to hear me. I checked my watch. It was 2:10 in the morning. The next shift wouldn't arrive until 7. I had nearly 5 hours until anyone would even think to look for me. 5 hours in a freezer that was operating well below safe temperatures for prolonged human exposure. I turned away from the useless intercom and tried to assess my situation with the same clinical detachment I'd bring to an autopsy. The freezer was large enough that I wouldn't run out of oxygen. That wasn't an immediate concern. But the temperature was. At 0 degrees Fahrenheit, hypothermia would begin to set in within an hour, maybe less given that I was only wearing thin scrubs and a lab coat. My extremities would go first, fingers and toes losing sensation, becoming clumsy and unresponsive. Then the core temperature would start to drop, leading to confusion, loss of coordination, eventually unconsciousness and cardiac arrest. I'd seen enough hypothermia cases to know the progression intimately. I needed to stay warm. I needed to keep moving. And I needed to find another way out, or at least find a way to signal for help that didn't rely on a broken intercom system. I started walking the perimeter of the freezer, searching for any other access point, any weakness in the walls or ceiling that might offer escape. The walls were solid concrete, the ceiling was reinforced metal panels, and there were no windows. The only way out was through that locked door. I completed my circuit and found myself back where I'd started, no closer to freedom than I'd been 10 minutes ago. That's when I heard the rustling again. Louder this time. Closer. It was coming from the center of the freezer, from somewhere among those rows of shelving and body bags. I stopped walking and stood perfectly still, listening. The sound continued, a slow, deliberate movement, unmistakably the sound of fabric sliding against metal. And then, beneath that, another sound, a soft, wet exhalation, like breath escaping from lungs that had been still for too long. My rational mind insisted it was impossible. The dead don't breathe. They don't move. But my senses were reporting something different, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up and sent ice water coursing through my veins. I raised my flashlight and pointed it toward the center of the freezer, toward the rows of shelving where the sound was originating. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating body bags and metal frames, casting long shadows that stretched and twisted in the cold air. And then, at the edge of my light's reach, I saw it. One of the body bags was moving. Not dramatically, not with violent thrashing, but with slow, purposeful shifts, as if something inside was trying to reorient itself, trying to sit up. I watched, unable to move, unable to breathe, as the bag continued its slow movement, the zipper bulging outward slightly, the fabric stretching and contracting in a rhythm that looked disturbingly like breathing. And then, from somewhere deeper in the freezer, from the shadows beyond my light, I heard another sound. The soft metallic scrape of a body bag being dragged across a metal shelf. Then another. And another. They were moving. The dead were moving. And I was locked in here with them. I need to tell you something about fear. Real fear, not the jump scare variety you experience in theaters or the mild anxiety of everyday stress. Real fear is a physical thing. It lives in your gut, in your chest, in the muscles of your legs that suddenly feel too weak to support your weight. It clouds your thinking, narrows your vision, floods your system with adrenaline that makes your hands shake and your heart pound so hard you think it might burst. In all my years working with the dead, I had never been afraid of them. They were inert matter, biological machines that had ceased functioning. They held no threat, no malice, no capacity for harm. But standing there in that freezer, watching those body bags move with slow, deliberate purpose, I felt fear in a way I hadn't since childhood, since those nights when I'd lie awake convinced that something was hiding in the darkness of my bedroom, waiting for me to close my eyes. This was that fear, fully realized, made manifest in a place where such things should not be possible. And yet, here it was. Happening. Undeniable. I took a step backward, then another, my eyes locked on the nearest moving bag. It had shifted position on its shelf, rotating slightly, the outline of a human form clearly visible beneath the black vinyl. The head was oriented toward me now, though I knew there was no way for whatever was inside to see me, to sense my presence. The dead don't see. They don't sense. But something inside that bag had oriented itself toward where I stood, and that awareness, that impossible awareness, was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of all. I backed up until I felt the cold metal of the entrance door against my spine, my flashlight beam still trained on the center of the freezer where the movement was concentrated. More bags were shifting now. I could count at least 7, scattered across different shelves, all moving with that same slow, deliberate purpose. Some were rotating, turning to face my direction. Others were inching forward, sliding incrementally toward the edges of their shelves as if preparing to drop to the floor. The rustling sounds had multiplied, creating a chorus of fabric and metal that echoed through the cold space. And beneath that, I could hear other sounds now, soft groans that seemed to emanate from inside the bags, low and prolonged, like air escaping from lungs that had been compressed for too long. I tried to tell myself it was decomposition gases, the natural accumulation of methane and other compounds that build up in a corpse and sometimes escape suddenly, creating sounds that could be mistaken for exhalations. But these sounds were too regular, too rhythmic. They sounded like breathing. Slow, labored breathing. I pressed myself harder against the door, my hand fumbling behind me for the handle, pulling on it uselessly even though I knew it wouldn't open. I was trapped. Trapped with 19 bodies that were no longer behaving like bodies should. And as I stood there, frozen with terror, one of the bags on the lowest shelf, a position that placed it at floor level, began to slide off its platform, landing on the concrete with a heavy, wet thump that reverberated through the freezer. The bag lay still for a moment after it hit the floor, and I allowed myself a brief flicker of hope that maybe this was all just some bizarre malfunction of the refrigeration system, creating vibrations that were causing the bags to shift position. But then the bag moved again. It didn't roll or tumble as it might if gravity or vibrations were the cause. It contracted. The middle section pulled inward, bending at what would be the waist, and then extended again, pushing the upper portion of the bag slightly forward across the floor. It was inching toward me, moving with the slow, determined progress of something dragging itself across ground using only the strength of its core muscles. I watched, unable to process what I was seeing, unable to reconcile it with everything I knew about death and decomposition and the absolute finality of biological cessation. Another bag dropped from a shelf, landing with that same heavy thump. Then another. They were falling now with increasing frequency, as if some signal had passed between them, some shared awareness that propelled them into coordinated action. Within 30 seconds, 5 bags lay on the floor of the freezer, and all 5 were moving, all 5 were making their slow, inexorable way toward where I stood against the locked door. I could see the identification tags swinging from their zippers as they moved, case numbers and dates and brief descriptions of the deceased. I recognized some of those numbers. I'd worked on those bodies myself, had opened them up and examined their organs and documented their injuries or diseases and then sealed them back up and sent them to storage. I knew what was inside those bags. I knew they were dead. But knowing something intellectually and accepting what your eyes are showing you are two very different things. I forced myself to think, to push through the paralysis of fear and engage the problem-solving part of my brain. There had to be an explanation. There had to be something I was missing, some rational cause for what appeared to be impossible. Perhaps this was a hallucination brought on by early-stage hypothermia. I'd read case studies of people experiencing vivid hallucinations when exposed to extreme cold, their brains misfiring as core temperature dropped. But I checked my watch again. I'd only been locked in here for maybe 20 minutes. Too soon for hypothermia-induced hallucinations. And besides, hallucinations wouldn't produce physical sounds, wouldn't create the echoes I was hearing as those body bags scraped across concrete. Could I be dreaming? Could I have fallen asleep at my desk upstairs and this entire scenario was just some stress-induced nightmare? I bit down hard on my lower lip, tasting blood, feeling the sharp clarity of pain that doesn't exist in dreams. No, this was real. I was awake. And the dead were moving. I had to accept that reality, however impossible it seemed, because denying it wouldn't change what was happening right in front of me. The 5 bags on the floor had covered about half the distance to where I stood. They moved slowly, tortuously slowly, but with unwavering purpose. And more bags were falling from the shelves now, joining the procession. I counted 8 on the floor now, all moving, all oriented toward me. The sounds had grown louder, the rustling of fabric, the scrape of vinyl against concrete, and those low, moaning exhalations that seemed to come from everywhere at once, filling the cold air with a kind of desperate, hungry resonance. I looked at my flashlight, the beam still trained on the approaching bags, and a thought occurred to me. Light. The dead shouldn't be able to perceive light, shouldn't be able to orient themselves toward or away from it. But maybe, if whatever force was animating these bodies retained some fragment of sensory awareness, maybe I could use that. I swung my flashlight beam away from the bags, pointing it instead toward the far corner of the freezer, hoping to draw their attention, to redirect their movement. For a moment, nothing changed. The bags continued their slow advance. But then, gradually, I saw a shift. One of the bags altered its trajectory slightly, angling more toward where my light was now pointed. Then another made the same adjustment. They were following the light. Not all of them, some continued straight toward me, but enough that I felt a small surge of hope. If they were following the light, maybe I could lead them away from the door, could create enough distance to examine the lock mechanism more carefully, to see if there was any way to force it open from the inside. I kept my flashlight pointed at the far corner and began moving along the wall, stepping carefully, watching as some of the bags adjusted their paths to follow the beam. Others, however, continued moving toward where I'd been standing, as if they'd locked onto my position and weren't going to be distracted by simple visual stimuli. Those were the ones that worried me most. Those were the ones that suggested something more than simple reanimation, something that implied a kind of awareness or intelligence that shouldn't exist in dead tissue. I made my way along the wall, keeping the flashlight aimed away from myself, moving slowly so as not to create sudden movements that might draw more attention. I needed to reach the control panel for the freezer systems. It was mounted on the wall near the back, a metal box containing the thermostat controls, the compressor switches, and the emergency shutdown systems. If I could access that panel, maybe I could trigger some kind of alarm, or perhaps even disable the refrigeration entirely, which would cause temperatures to rise and might trigger automatic alerts in the main building's monitoring station. It was a long shot, but it was the only plan I could formulate in the midst of this nightmare. I kept moving, my back pressed against the cold wall, my eyes shifting between the approaching bags on the floor and the ones still on the shelves that continued to shift and rustle with increasing agitation. I'd made it about halfway to the control panel when one of the bags, one that had been on a high shelf, well above my head, fell directly in front of me, landing with such force that I felt the impact through the soles of my shoes. I jumped back, nearly losing my grip on the flashlight, and stared at the bag lying at my feet. This one was different. I could see that immediately. The others had been moving slowly, almost lethargically, but this one was thrashing. The entire length of it convulsed and writhed, the zipper straining against the force of whatever was inside. And the sounds coming from it were louder, more urgent, not moans but something closer to screams, muffled by the thick vinyl but unmistakably human, unmistakably anguished. I recognized the tag number. This was a suicide case from 2 weeks ago, a young woman who'd overdosed on barbiturates, found in her apartment 3 days after death. I'd performed the autopsy myself and noted the advanced decomposition, the discoloration and bloating typical of bodies left unrefrigerated in warm environments. There should have been nothing left inside that bag capable of producing the violent movements I was witnessing. But the bag continued to thrash, and as I watched, paralyzed by equal parts horror and morbid fascination, the zipper began to move. Not from the outside, but from within. Something inside was pulling it open. I turned and ran. Abandoning my careful wall-hugging strategy, abandoning any pretense of rational investigation, I simply ran toward the back of the freezer where the control panel was located. My flashlight beam bounced wildly as I sprinted between the rows of shelving, illuminating glimpses of more bags shifting on their platforms, more bodies beginning to rouse themselves from their supposed eternal rest. I could hear pursuit behind me, not footsteps, but the sound of bags sliding across concrete, moving faster now, accelerated by some force I couldn't begin to understand. The sounds of moaning and rustling had crescendoed into a cacophony that seemed to press against my eardrums, seemed to vibrate in my chest cavity. I reached the control panel and yanked open the metal cover, my hands shaking so badly I could barely manipulate the switches inside. I found the emergency shutdown and flipped it, heard the compressors immediately begin to wind down, their constant hum fading to silence. That silence lasted only a moment before being filled with something worse, the unobstructed sounds of the moving bags, no longer masked by mechanical noise. I turned, pressing my back against the control panel, and swept my flashlight across the freezer. What I saw has never left me. In all my years since that night, in all the autopsies and investigations and long quiet hours of retirement, that image remains burned into my memory with perfect clarity. Every single body bag was moving now. All 19 of them. Some were on the floor, dragging themselves toward where I stood. Others were sliding off their shelves, dropping with heavy impacts that seemed to shake the very foundation of the building. And several, at least 3 that I could see clearly in my wildly moving light, had partially unzipped themselves, and pale, decomposed hands were emerging from the openings, fingers splayed and grasping at nothing, searching for purchase, for leverage, for something to pull themselves forward toward their singular apparent goal. Me. I want to pause here and tell you something about the human mind's capacity for rationalization. Even in the midst of absolute terror, even when confronted with the impossible, we continue to search for explanations that fit within our understanding of how reality works. As I stood there with my back against that control panel, watching those body bags advance toward me, a part of my brain was still trying to make sense of it all, still cataloging details and searching for rational causes. Could this be some kind of elaborate prank? But who would orchestrate such a thing, and how would they have hidden themselves inside body bags, and how could they have known I'd be trapped in here tonight? Could it be some kind of mass hallucination caused by carbon monoxide from malfunctioning equipment? But carbon monoxide doesn't create uniform hallucinations across multiple people, and I was alone. Could it be some unknown neurological condition causing me to perceive movement where none existed? But I could hear the sounds, could feel the vibrations through the floor as bags hit the concrete. This wasn't perception. This wasn't imagination. This was happening. The dead were moving. And my carefully constructed worldview, my decades of scientific training, my absolute certainty about the nature of death and the finality of biological cessation, all of it was crumbling in the face of irrefutable evidence that I was wrong. That we're all wrong. That death is not the end we believe it to be, or at least, not always, not in all circumstances. And that realization, that fundamental unmaking of everything I built my life's work upon, was in some ways more terrifying than the physical threat advancing toward me across that freezing concrete floor. The bags were within 10 feet of me now, a semicircle of black vinyl and exposed decomposing flesh, all oriented toward where I stood. I could see them more clearly than I wanted to, could see the details that my clinical training had taught me to observe and document. The bag on my left contained what had been a middle-aged male, approximately 2 months deceased based on the advanced decomposition visible through the partially open zipper. The skin had taken on that greenish-black discoloration, marbled with ruptured blood vessels, and the features were bloated beyond recognition. But the hand that extended from the bag was moving with deliberate intent, fingers curling and uncurling, reaching toward me. Another bag, this one more recently deceased, showed less decomposition, but the movements were equally impossible. The entire form inside was shifting, attempting to raise itself up, to achieve some kind of vertical orientation despite the constraints of the vinyl enclosure. I could see the outline of a face pressing against the fabric from the inside, distorting the smooth surface, mouth open in what might have been a scream if any air could move through those dead lungs. The sounds had changed now. The moaning had given way to something more articulated, something that almost resembled words, though too distorted and overlapping for me to make out specific syllables. It was as if all 19 bodies were trying to speak at once, trying to communicate something, to convey some message that their dead vocal cords and collapsed lungs could only approximate. I pressed myself harder against the control panel, feeling the sharp edges of switches and dials digging into my back, and I realized with crystalline clarity that I was about to die. Not from hypothermia, not from some mechanical failure or medical emergency, but from something that shouldn't exist, something that violated every law of nature I'd ever learned. The dead were going to kill me, and no one would ever believe what had really happened. But then something changed. The bag stopped moving. All at once, simultaneously, as if responding to some unheard signal, they ceased their advance. The sounds cut off mid-moan, leaving only silence and the fading echoes of their movement. I stood frozen, not daring to move, not even daring to breathe, waiting to see what would happen next. Long seconds passed. The bags remained still, arrayed in their semicircle around me, close enough that I could have reached out and touched the nearest one. But they didn't advance further. Slowly, carefully, I raised my flashlight and swept it across the scene. The hands that had been reaching toward me were now still. The forms that had been writhing were now motionless. It was as if someone had simply switched them off, had severed whatever force had been animating them. I waited, counting my heartbeats, listening for any sound that might indicate a resumption of movement. Nothing. The freezer had returned to the stillness that should have been there all along, the stillness of death, a final and irrevocable cessation. I didn't understand what had happened, didn't understand why they had stopped, but I wasn't going to waste the opportunity. I stepped carefully around the perimeter of the semicircle, keeping my light trained on the bags, ready to bolt at the first sign of movement. None came. I made my way back toward the entrance, moving as quickly as I dared without running, checking over my shoulder every few steps to ensure nothing was following. I reached the door and examined the lock mechanism more carefully now that I had time and relative safety. The emergency release handle was definitely broken. I could see that the internal cable had snapped, probably years ago, probably never reported or repaired because who checks emergency equipment in a morgue freezer? But there was another option. The lock itself was electronic, operated by a solenoid that responded to signals from the exterior control panel. But like all electronic locks, it had a mechanical override, a keyhole hidden beneath a small metal plate. I used my fingernail to pry the plate loose, revealing the keyhole underneath. I didn't have a key. The keys for the secondary freezer were kept in the security office, 2 floors up. But I did have something else. I reached into the pocket of my lab coat and pulled out a small set of instruments I always carried, forceps, a small scalpel, and a probe. The probe was thin and flexible, designed for exploring wound channels during autopsy. I inserted it into the keyhole and began working the lock mechanism, feeling for the pins and tumblers, trying to manipulate them into the correct positions. It took several minutes of careful work, my fingers growing increasingly numb from the cold, but finally I felt something shift, felt the internal mechanism give way. I turned the probe and heard the blessed sound of the solenoid disengaging, the lock releasing. I pulled on the handle and the door opened, pneumatic hinges hissing softly, spilling cold air into the slightly warmer corridor beyond. I stumbled out, pulling the door closed behind me, my legs weak and unsteady, my heart still pounding. I stood in that corridor, breathing heavily, staring at the closed door of the secondary freezer, trying to process what had just happened to me. Trying to understand. Trying to rationalize. And utterly failing to do any of those things. I need to tell you what happened next, though it may disappoint you. I didn't run screaming to the nearest phone to report what I'd experienced. I didn't immediately launch an investigation or demand explanations from my colleagues. I did what most people do when confronted with the inexplicable. I doubted myself. I stood in that corridor for a long time, maybe 20 minutes, leaning against the wall, letting my body temperature gradually return to normal, and I talked myself out of what I'd seen. It was hallucination brought on by hypothermia, I told myself. It was stress and lack of sleep and the particular psychology of being trapped alone in a confined space filled with dead bodies. It was anything but what it appeared to be, because what it appeared to be was impossible, and impossible things don't happen, not in the real world, not at a modern forensic facility in Los Angeles in 1987. I eventually walked back to my office, sat down at my desk, and stared at the wall until my shift ended at 7 in the morning. When the day staff arrived, I didn't mention anything about being locked in the freezer. I filed a maintenance report about the broken emergency release handle, noting it as a routine safety concern discovered during a late-night inspection. I went home, took a long hot shower, and slept for 12 hours. And when I woke up, I had almost convinced myself that the entire episode had been some kind of dream or altered state of consciousness, something that hadn't really happened in the way I remembered it. Almost convinced, but not entirely, because I couldn't explain away the physical evidence. My lab coat was torn in several places, ripped by sharp edges as I pressed myself against the control panel. My fingers were bruised from working the lock mechanism. And when I returned to work the next night and checked the logbook, I found my own entry noting that I'd shut down the secondary freezer compressors at approximately 2:35 in the morning. That entry existed. I'd written it, which meant some part of what I remembered had definitely happened. I'd been in that freezer. I'd activated the emergency shutdown. Something had occurred that prompted me to take that action. Even if the details of what I'd witnessed remained unclear, the core facts were undeniable. And that kept me from dismissing the entire experience as fantasy. Over the following weeks, I found myself drawn back to the secondary freezer, though I never entered it alone again. I made reasons to visit, inventory checks, equipment inspections, supervising the transfer of newly deceased into storage. Each time I went in there, accompanied by colleagues or daytime staff, everything appeared normal. The body bags lay still on their shelves, inert and unmoving, exactly as they should be. I would study them, searching for any sign of what I'd witnessed that night, but there was nothing. No torn zippers, no displaced bags on the floor, no evidence that anything unusual had ever occurred. I began to wonder if I'd somehow misremembered the entire sequence of events, if my brain had constructed a narrative from fragments of dream and reality and stress that bore little resemblance to what had actually happened. But then I would remember the specifics, the cold precision of detail that had nothing dreamlike about it. The exact number of bags on the floor. The particular tags I've recognized. The feel of that probe working the lock mechanism, the resistance of the pins and tumblers under my fingers. Dreams don't have that kind of granular detail. Hallucinations don't maintain that kind of internal consistency. No, something had happened that night, something real, even if I couldn't reconcile it with everything else I knew to be true about death and decomposition. I started researching. I spent my off hours in medical libraries, reading case studies and historical accounts, looking for any similar incidents. I found scattered reports, most of them old, most of them easily dismissed as superstition or pre-scientific misunderstanding. Tales of bodies moving in morgues, of corpses sitting up during autopsies, of the dead seeming to respond to external stimuli. But these were always explained away: muscle contractions from decomposition gases, post-mortem spasms triggered by temperature changes, the settling of tissues as rigor mortis faded. Nothing I found suggested coordinated movement, nothing described the kind of purposeful, directed action I'd witnessed. Nothing, that is, in the mainstream medical literature. But there were other sources. Older sources. I discovered a journal article from 1923, published in an obscure German medical publication, describing an incident at a Berlin morgue where several bodies had apparently moved their storage positions overnight, though no one had entered the facility. The night watchman had reported hearing sounds from the morgue, sounds he described as moaning and shuffling, but when the morning staff arrived, everything was in order except that 3 bodies previously stored on lower shelves were now on upper shelves, and 2 that had been in the upper positions were now on the floor. The incident was investigated and eventually attributed to the watchman having moved the bodies himself during some kind of somnambulistic episode, though the man swore he never entered the morgue proper. I found another account, even older, from a French hospital in the late 1800s, where an attendant claimed to have witnessed bodies in the hospital's deadhouse attempting to break free from their shrouds during a particularly violent thunderstorm. That account was even more thoroughly dismissed as the ravings of an alcoholic, and the attendant was subsequently dismissed from his position. But the description he'd given, preserved in hospital administrative records, bore an uncomfortable similarity to what I'd experienced: the slow, deliberate movements, the sense of coordinated purpose, the way the bodies had seemed to orient themselves toward the living person in the room. I found a third account, this one from a rural American county morgue in the 1930s, where the medical examiner on duty had been found unconscious inside the cold storage room, suffering from hypothermia despite the fact that he'd been locked inside for less than an hour. When questioned later, he claimed that the bodies had moved and trapped him against the far wall and somehow prevented him from reaching the door. His account was dismissed as the confused ramblings of someone suffering from severe hypothermia-induced delirium, and he subsequently resigned his position and left medicine entirely. These accounts, scattered across decades and continents, all dismissed and explained away and forgotten. But taken together, they suggested something. A pattern. A recurring phenomenon that modern medicine had decided couldn't exist and therefore didn't, regardless of what witnesses reported. I became convinced that I'd experienced something real that night, something that had been experienced by others before me but had been systematically rationalized away because it didn't fit into our scientific understanding of death. But conviction without evidence is just belief, and I was too much of a scientist to be comfortable operating on belief alone. I needed to understand what had happened, needed to find some explanation that could bridge the gap between the impossible thing I'd witnessed and the possible explanations my training demanded. I started looking into the specific bodies that had been in the freezer that night. I pulled their case files, reviewed their autopsy reports, searched for any commonality that might explain why those particular remains had exhibited such bizarre behavior. It was a painstaking process. I had to be subtle about it, couldn't let my colleagues know what I was investigating because they would have thought I was losing my grip on reality. But slowly, a pattern began to emerge. Of the 19 bodies that had been in that freezer, 11 had died what we classified as sudden or traumatic deaths, car accidents, homicides, suicides, heart attacks. Deaths that came without warning, without time for the consciousness to prepare or accept what was happening. The other 8 had died from more prolonged illnesses or conditions, deaths that had come gradually, with time for awareness and acceptance. And of those 19, 13 had been found alone. They had died in solitude, whether by choice or circumstance, and their bodies have remained undiscovered for anywhere from several hours to several days. I didn't know what to make of this pattern at first. But the more I thought about it, the more I remembered certain cases from my years of work, certain oddities that I noted but never really examined closely. Bodies that had been found in positions that didn't quite match the expected post-mortem changes. Reports from mortuary attendants of hearing sounds in storage areas when no one was supposed to be there. Small inconsistencies that could always be explained away individually but that started to look different when viewed as part of a larger pattern. I began to develop a theory, though calling it a theory might be too generous. It was more of a hypothesis, one that I couldn't possibly test or prove, but that seemed to fit the limited data I had available. What if death wasn't as instantaneous as we believed? What if consciousness didn't simply switch off at the moment of biological cessation? What if there was a period, variable in length, depending on circumstances, during which some fragment of awareness remained trapped in dead tissue, unable to communicate, unable to move through normal means, but not entirely gone? And what if, under certain conditions, extreme cold, electrical phenomena, or factors I couldn't even begin to identify, that trapped consciousness could somehow briefly interact with the physical world, could create movement, could animate its own remains in desperate attempts to, what? Communicate? Escape? Simply to be acknowledged as still existing in some form? It was absurd. It violated everything we knew about neurology and consciousness and the electrochemical processes that created what we think of as awareness. Once the brain ceased receiving oxygen, once neural activity flatlined, that was it. Consciousness couldn't exist without functional neural tissue. That was established science, proven 1,000 times over. But established science hadn't been locked in a freezer with 19 moving corpses. Established science hadn't felt the cold certainty of those bodies moving with purpose and coordination impossible to explain through muscle spasms or decomposition gases. I had. And that experience, however impossible, however much it violated everything I'd been taught, had happened. I couldn't unknow what I'd witnessed. I couldn't unsee those reaching hands or unhear those terrible moaning sounds. So I was left in this uncomfortable place between scientific certainty and lived experience, unable to reconcile the two, unable to abandon either. It's a place I've remained ever since that February night, a kind of philosophical limbo that has colored everything about how I view my work and my understanding of what we are and what happens when we cease to be. I never told anyone the full story. Not my colleagues at the coroner's office, not my wife at the time, not anyone who might have demanded explanations or evidence I couldn't provide. I filed it away as a personal mystery, something that happened to me alone and that I would have to process alone. The secondary freezer's emergency release handle was eventually repaired, though I made sure to always carry the override key with me whenever I worked overnight shifts after that. I never allowed myself to be in that particular freezer alone again. Whenever procedures required accessing stored remains from that facility, I always brought a colleague with me, always made sure there was a second person present. I told myself it was about safety, about proper protocol, about learning from a near-miss accident. And maybe that was partly true. But mostly, it was about fear. About the deep, primal terror that had taken root in me that night and that never entirely faded, even as months and years passed. I spent the remainder of my career, another 28 years, working with the dead, examining them, documenting their injuries and diseases, determining causes and manners of death. I became quite good at it, built a reputation as a thorough and reliable medical examiner. But there was always this layer of uncertainty beneath my professional confidence, this awareness that maybe I didn't understand death as well as I thought I did, that maybe none of us do. We measure and document and classify. We apply our scientific method to the study of mortality, but we're looking at it all from the outside, from the perspective of the living. We assume that death is silent because the dead don't speak to us in ways we can easily understand. We assume it's still because most of the time the dead don't move. But what if those assumptions are wrong? What if death is less like an off switch and more like a transition into something we simply lack the tools to observe or measure? What if consciousness doesn't end but merely changes, transforms into something so fundamentally different that we can't recognize it anymore, can't interact with it except under very specific and unusual circumstances? The years passed. I moved through cases, through celebrity deaths that made headlines and anonymous deaths that interested no one beyond their immediate families. I watched forensic science advance, saw the introduction of DNA analysis and improved toxicology screening and computer-assisted reconstruction of traumatic injuries. I trained younger colleagues, passed on my knowledge and experience, taught them the protocols and procedures that had guided my work. But I never taught them about that night in the freezer. I never shared the deeper questions it had raised about consciousness and death and the possibility that we're all operating under fundamental misunderstandings about what happens when we cease to be. How could I? They would have thought I was senile or delusional. They would have quietly suggested I consider early retirement. And maybe they would have been right to do so. Maybe I had hallucinated the entire thing. Maybe early-stage hypothermia really had created false memories that felt completely real. Maybe I'd been more stressed and sleep-deprived than I realized and had experienced some kind of break from reality that my mind then worked hard to rationalize and make coherent. These are all plausible explanations. They're far more plausible than the alternative that the dead can move, can demonstrate awareness, can act with coordinated purpose under certain conditions. Plausible explanations should be preferred. That's basic scientific reasoning. And yet I can't shake the memory of those moments, can't dismiss them as easily as logic suggests I should. The terror I felt was real. The physical details were consistent. And the pattern I discovered in those case files, the commonalities among the bodies that had been in that freezer, those weren't hallucinations. Those were documented facts that existed independent of my perception. Something connected those particular remains. Something made them different from the hundreds of other bodies that passed through that freezer before and after without incident. I don't know what that something was. I may never know. But it was real. Of that much, I remain certain. I retired in 2015 after 42 years in the field, and I left with that mystery still unsolved, still sitting in the back of my mind like a splinter I couldn't quite extract. I thought perhaps that stepping away from the work, from the constant exposure to death and decomposition, might allow me to gain some perspective, might help me finally integrate that experience into a coherent understanding or lay it to rest as an unexplained anomaly not worth further consideration. But retirement hasn't provided those answers. If anything, it's given me more time to think about that night, more time to turn it over in my mind and examine it from different angles without the distraction of daily casework. I've read more widely in my retirement than I ever could during my career: philosophy, neuroscience, quantum physics, even some religious and mystical texts that discuss consciousness and the afterlife in ways I would have dismissed out of hand 40 years ago. And what I've come to realize is that science, for all its power and precision, for all the remarkable insights it's given us into the nature of reality, still can't fully explain consciousness. We don't really understand how electrochemical processes in the brain give rise to subjective experience, to the feeling of being someone, of having an inner life. We can map neural correlates of consciousness, can identify which brain regions light up during specific mental states, but we can't explain the hard problem: why any of that physical activity should produce the sensation of awareness. And if we can't fully explain consciousness in the living, How can we be confident we understand what happens to it in death? Maybe it doesn't simply cease. Maybe it transforms, becoming something we lack the instruments to detect or the framework to comprehend. Maybe, under very specific circumstances, it can still interact with the material world in ways that appear impossible but that are simply operating according to rules we haven't discovered yet. I don't claim to know. I'm not proposing a theory or arguing for a specific understanding of what happened that night. I'm simply acknowledging that there's more to death than what we see in morgues and autopsy suites, more to consciousness than what we can measure with EEGs and brain scans, and that our current scientific paradigm, comprehensive as it is, may still be missing some fundamental aspect of what we are and what becomes of us when our bodies fail. I'm telling you this story now because I'm 67 years old, because I've been retired for 9 years, and because I've carried this experience along for long enough. I don't expect you to believe me. I don't expect you to accept what I'm describing as literal truth rather than the confused memories of a frightened man trapped in a cold room. But I'm sharing it because maybe someone listening has had a similar experience, has witnessed something in a morgue or a hospital or a funeral home that they couldn't explain, that violated everything they knew about death, and they've been carrying that experience in silence, doubting themselves, wondering if they were losing their minds. If that's you, if you've seen something you can't explain, know that you're not alone. Know that these experiences happen, rare as they are, and that the fact that science can't currently explain them doesn't mean they didn't happen. The universe is stranger and more complex than we like to admit. Death is a mystery that we've only barely begun to understand. And consciousness, that precious, indefinable thing that makes us who we are, may be far more resilient and far stranger than we've ever imagined. That's what that night in the freezer taught me. That's the lesson I've carried with me every day since, through thousands of autopsies, through decades of determining causes of death and signing death certificates and sending bodies on to their final dispositions. We don't know. We think we do. We act as if we do. But we don't. Not really. And maybe that's okay. Maybe some mysteries aren't meant to be solved with scalpels and microscopes. Maybe some truths can only be approached through direct experience, through those rare and terrible moments when the membrane between life and death becomes thin enough to see through, even if only for a moment. The secondary freezer at the Los Angeles County Coroner's office is still there, still in use. I've checked. The facility has been renovated several times since my retirement, equipment has been upgraded, procedures have changed, but that particular freezer remains, tucked away in the back of the building, its heavy insulated door still locking automatically from the outside. New medical examiners work there now, younger people who never knew me, who have their own cases to process and their own mysteries to unravel. I wonder sometimes if any of them have experienced anything strange in that space. I wonder if the phenomenon I witnessed was unique to that particular night, that particular combination of circumstances and bodies, or if it's something that happens occasionally, rarely, but consistently enough that others have seen it too and, like me, have chosen to remain silent rather than risk their professional reputations by reporting the impossible. I'll never know. That's not the kind of thing people talk about openly, not in a scientific field that demands empirical evidence and reproducible results. But I suspect I'm not the only one. I suspect that in morgues and medical examiner facilities around the world, there are people who've seen things they can't explain, who've witnessed moments when death revealed itself to be something other than the simple biological cessation we pretend it is. And I hope that some of them, hearing this account, will feel less alone in their experience, less doubtful of their own perceptions. What we saw was real, even if we can't prove it. What we experienced mattered, even if we can't explain it. And the questions it raises about consciousness and death and the nature of what we are, those questions are worth asking, worth sitting with, worth carrying forward even when we can't find satisfying answers. I want to leave you with one final thought before we close. In all my years working with the dead, I learned that death is not democratic. It comes for everyone eventually, but it comes in different ways, under different circumstances, and maybe, just maybe, it leads to different destinations or different states of being. The person who dies peacefully in their sleep surrounded by loved ones may experience death very differently than the person who dies violently and alone. The consciousness that has time to prepare and accept may transition differently than the consciousness that is suddenly severed from life without warning. We treat death as if it's all the same, cessation of biological function, period, but maybe that's an oversimplification. Maybe death is as individual as life, as variable, as complex. And maybe what I witnessed that night in the freezer was what happens when death goes wrong somehow, when consciousness gets trapped in the transition, when the normal process is interrupted or delayed, leaving something behind that shouldn't still be there but is, struggling in the darkness, reaching out in desperation or confusion or simply to make contact one more time with the world of the living it can no longer fully inhabit. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if any interpretation I might offer has any validity at all. But it's what I think about late at night sometimes, when sleep won't come and my mind drifts back to that February evening in 1987, to that cold room, to those moving body bags and reaching hands and terrible moaning sounds that should not have existed but did. And I think about all the bodies I've examined since then, all the remains I've processed and documented and released for burial or cremation, and I wonder how many of them might have contained some fragment of awareness still, something that wanted to communicate or escape or simply to be acknowledged as still existing in some form. How many times did I miss it? Did I dismiss some subtle sign or anomaly because I was too committed to my scientific worldview to see what was right in front of me? How many chances did I have to learn something profound about consciousness and death, and how many did I let slip by because I was too afraid of appearing foolish or delusional to pursue them? These are questions I'll carry to my own death, whenever that comes. And when it does, I hope I'll die well, peacefully, surrounded by people I care about, with time to prepare and accept, with my consciousness allowed to make whatever transition it needs to make without interruption or complication. But if I don't, if my death is sudden and alone, if my consciousness gets trapped somehow in that liminal space I've witnessed others inhabiting, I hope someone notices. I hope someone sees the signs and doesn't dismiss them. I hope I don't end up like those bodies in that freezer, reaching out in darkness, moaning in confusion, trying desperately to communicate with a world that insists I no longer exist. That's my greatest fear now, after decades of working with death. Not that death will come, but that it will come incompletely, that I'll be caught between states, neither fully alive nor fully gone, aware but unable to communicate that awareness, trapped in the cold and the dark with no one understanding that I'm still here, still conscious, still needing help or release or simply acknowledgement. It's not a rational fear. I know that. But then again, nothing about that night in the freezer was rational. And experiences like that change you, permanently, fundamentally, in ways you can't simply reason away. So that's my story. That's what happened to me in the secondary freezer of the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office on a cold February night in 1987. It's not a complete story. I have no ending, no resolution, no satisfying explanation that ties everything together. It's just an experience, strange and terrible and impossible, that happened to someone who spent his entire career trying to understand death in rational, scientific terms. Make of it what you will. Believe it or dismiss it as you see fit. But if you take nothing else from this account, take this: be kind to the dead. Treat them with dignity and respect, not just because it's the ethical thing to do, but because we don't fully understand what they are or where they've gone. That body on the table, that remains in the ground, that ash scattered to the wind, we call it dead because it's no longer functioning in ways we recognize as life. But maybe there's more to it than that. Maybe consciousness lingers in ways we can't detect. Maybe awareness persists in forms we can't measure. Maybe the dead are more present than we realize, watching from somewhere beyond the membrane we call death, waiting for us to finally see them, to finally understand that they never fully left. I don't know if that's true, but after that night in the freezer, I can't dismiss the possibility. None of us can, not really, not if we're being honest about the limits of our knowledge and the mysteries that still surround the most fundamental aspects of human existence. Death is one of those mysteries. Consciousness is another. And where they intersect, in that moment of transition, there may be truths waiting that we're not yet ready to comprehend, but that reveal themselves occasionally, briefly, to those unlucky or privileged enough to witness them. I was one of those witnesses. This is what I saw. And I'll carry it with me until my own death finally comes to claim whatever I am, whatever spark of awareness animates this aging body and thinks these thoughts and remembers that cold February night when the dead moved and I stood alone among them, terrified and transformed in ways I still struggle to fully articulate.